Hi there, welcome to another King's Daily, and we're continuing to work our way through the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 26 now, where we pick up the story of Paul, who is still in prison, imprisoned for telling people about Jesus, and picking up the story, he's been in front of Festus and Felix, who are governors in Caesarea, and he's had to give a defense to them. And now King Agrippa has arrived on the scene, and he wants to hear Paul out. And Paul has another opportunity to tell his story to King Agrippa. And rather than read through the whole chapter or anything, I just want to pull out a few hopefully helpful lessons here in terms of that can help us, if you're a Christ follower, when we have those opportunities to share our story. And the first one was this, that Paul wasn't kind of pushy with his story. In this instance, he was invited by King Agrippa to speak. And fair enough in that context, if someone's a prisoner, then they need to be given permission to speak by the one in authority. At least that's my understanding of the situation. But it's not that we have to wait until someone specifically gives us permission to share our story. But I think there's a principle here about not being pushy, not trying to shoehorn Jesus into conversations in an unhelpful way, not trying to shove the gospel down people's throat, but just praying for, being proactive in sharing our faith, but looking for those moments where we're invited to share our story and be ready to do so. The second thing I think we see here is Paul made it personal. In verse 1 to verse 21, really it's Paul telling his story, and he's just telling it how it is. I think sometimes people can fall into the trap of thinking, oh, my story's not very spectacular. You know, I wasn't persecuting the church and murdering Christians before becoming a Christ follower myself. But actually, every story is precious. Every story is important. And different stories will speak to different people. So we just tell the story how it is. And Paul gives a helpful framework here as well, really. He tells about his story before Jesus, what his life was like and what he was like. Then he goes into talking about how he became a Christian, became a Christ follower. Yes, there was a sudden kind of moment, if you like, for Paul on the road to Damascus. But also it seems like there was a whole process surrounding that, because even in that moment, Jesus says to him, and it says it here, that Paul, you find it hard to kick against the goads. And the goads was this stick that would prod animals and get them on the right path and get them going in the right direction. And Paul was kicking against that, maybe in his conscience, maybe not being willing to admit that actually he was becoming convinced of some of the things that he was hearing from the disciples and what they were saying about Jesus. Or maybe it was witnessing the martyrdom of Stephen and how he died and the words that he spoke. But whatever it was, there was both process and also a moment that Paul shares. And then Paul also talks about his life after Jesus and following Jesus as well. And for us, it doesn't mean you become a Christian and suddenly life's all sorted in a bed of roses and there's no difficulties, there's no challenges, there's no doubts. It's just not like that. And so it's just being honest with what following Jesus is like and the difference he makes in our lives, but with both the challenges and the joys and the struggles and the successes. It's just being real with people in the telling of our story. So he made it personal. He pointed them to Jesus. You know, ultimately that's what we're doing. We're not pointing people to ourselves as witnesses. We're saying, hey, this is who Jesus is. This is what he's done in my life. This is what he's done on the cross. Paul talks about his death. He talks about his resurrection. And the way to kind of grow in confidence of the gospel is to really immerse yourself in the gospel. Live in the good of the gospel of grace yourself every day. Read the stories of Jesus. Deepen your understanding of what Jesus has done. Maybe get some good tour guides. A good book is like a good tour guide, or podcasts or whatever, people helping you. Phil Moore's written some helpful little commentaries, Straight to the Heart series on some of the Gospels. They're really helpful. Mike Reeves' book, Christ Our Life, that's a great book, and that will help you deepen your understanding of the gospel, but also your love of God as well. And that our witness is to flow from that place of being amazed at God's grace in our own lives, that it spills over into the lives of others. So he pointed him to Jesus. He made it personal. He wasn't pushy. He spoke the people's language. King Agrippa knew the ways of Judaism, and Paul says to him, you know the prophets, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about Moses and the Old Testament. He spoke Agrippa's language. What's interesting, when Paul was in Acts 17, when Paul was in Athens, and he's speaking on Mars Hill to people from different backgrounds, they didn't come from Jewish backgrounds. He doesn't quote the Old Testament prophets or point them to the Old Testament prophets. In fact, he quotes their own poets. He speaks in language that they can understand. And it's important that we learn to do that we don't just use words, sort of Christian language, theological language maybe, that people don't really understand, but we learn to explain these things as we understand them more ourselves. So we speak the people's language, we're just plain in our speech. And finally, he was clear on his purpose as well. Paul knew what his aim was. Verse 29, 28, 29, Agrippa says to him, in a short time, will you persuade me to become a Christian? And Paul's like, well, yeah, of course I want you to know Jesus. Of course I want you to know this amazing grace and love of God and salvation, who Jesus is. I want you to know this. Of course I want you to become a Christian. Paul was clear on his purpose as well. In fact, Romans 10 verse 1, he prays this, and maybe we make this our prayer as we think about telling our story to those around us. Paul says, my desire and prayer to God is for their salvation. Hope it's been helpful. Thanks for listening. Take care.